Hello, and welcome back to Weston the Historian. Today, well, you'll probably notice there's a big change in the scenery. So I've just moved in to college. That's right, Weston the Historian is now training to be a real historian. And I'm a history major, isn't that huge? Isn't that awesome? So, down the line, wanting to be a history professor at a university, isn't that awesome? So anyway, all of that aside, today I wanted to talk about the term Old Stock American and WASP American and all these other terms, because these are two terms that are very important and probably will continue to be more important as the political landscape changes. I think you're probably going to hear these terms a lot more as time goes on, especially Old Stock American, but I wanted to talk about both terms because they both have a similar meaning and are connected, but not quite exactly the same. So, let's start off with Old Stock American. What is an Old Stock American? We have an ethnic American. If you take the U.S. Census, you'll notice that under ethnicities, one of them listed is American. And of course, you might be like, what is an ethnic American? Is that Native Americans? Is that British people? And you would be correct about saying it's British people, partially. Because when someone is referring to an old stock American, that is usually referring to someone who can trace their lineage back to the American Revolution or before. Someone who their ancestors have been here since like Jamestown to 1776, anytime between that. So that's a pretty broad category because a lot of people think that's just English people, but that's not quite the case. It's the English, but it's also the Scottish, to an extent the Irish and Scotch-Irish. That's Germans, to an extent, the French, Danish, some other Scandinavian groups. But for the most part, that's it. And that is a very small group. That is, if I recall correctly, about 100 million people in America, and America has over 500 million people in it. But about 100 million people in America identify as ethnically American. So these are people who are descended from these original groups. Now, it should be noted that even in these specific groups, different people from different classes ended up settling in different areas. And this is why there's a very, very different culture depending on what region you go to in the United States. So, of course, by the 1770s, when America became independent, there were what they used to call the northern colonies, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies. The northern colonies is like what we now call like New England. The middle colonies, that's like New York, Pennsylvania, those areas. And then the southern colonies, so that's the South. That's Dixieland, that's Georgia. And then the Carolinas, Virginia, eventually Florida, and then, so on and so forth. But anyway, these developed different cultures not only because they had to rely on different forms of agriculture and different trade, but also because they were settled by different people. And specifically in England, a lot of these like more Puritan types ended up in the north. And these were people who had this like fiercely independent mindset. They already were like, we don't want to have anything to do with England or Europe in general. And a lot of the English settled there, but then so did the Irish and the Scottish and the Germans. And what's interesting is if you actually look at the first U.S. Census, you will see that Pennsylvania was almost majority German. There was just as many Germans as there were English people, which it was the only state that was like that. The other states had sizable German populations, but Pennsylvania was uniquely German at the time. But all that to say, there was more Puritans in the north, but the south had a lot more aristocratic types, these cavalier types from England and also France and other places, but it was settled by a lot more aristocratic types, and that's how you ended up with this culture based around power and based around owning slaves, having slaves, and they had this kind of high culture, high view of themselves, and there was this notion of them being cavaliers. So that was a big notion in the South. There was a notion of cavaliers. There was a notion of being European. So even though a lot of Southerners did fight in the American Revolution, after the Revolution, the Southern society still looked very European compared to the North. There was still like a very rigid hierarchy. There was what could be described as an aristocratic system in place. But the South was much closer to Europe than the North because it was settled by people who still had this connection to Europe and European power because it was settled by aristocrats. Not entirely, but there was a sizable amount of people who had this aristocratic background who were settling the South. And anyway, all of that aside, yeah, so that's basically what an old stock American is, someone who is descended from these groups that originally settled the 13 colonies and early America. Now, this is an important topic because America has had a weird and very complicated history of immigration. If you're looking at politics now, that's very obvious, but it's always been like this. There's always been a lot of controversy around the issue. In the 19th century, it was more open. You had, that's how you got the Ellis Island group, which is like Irish Americans, Italian Americans, to an extent Slavic and other German Americans. But then, and you had like poets like Walt Whitman who would celebrate this. But then as time went on, you had increasing native ascendants as a result of this, and America ended up being a lot more restrictive. And it's just been this kind of weird tidal wave of being loose, and then nativism starts spreading, and nationalism starts spreading. People get more restricted, and then it just kind of repeats in that cycle forever, indefinitely. But anyway, all of that aside, that's what an old stock American is, someone who's been here since colonial times. So now I want to talk about what is a WASP. What is a WASP American? Because that's another term. And that is very much connected to the term old stock American, because most old stock Americans would fall under this group, and most people that fall under this group are probably old stock Americans. So this term means white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So Anglo-Saxon is referring to the original, the people who created England. I wasn't going to say the original English. Before the Anglo-Saxons, England wasn't England. It was Britannia, and it was Celtic and Roman. And these Germanic groups called the Anglos, or the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes took over and created what we now call England. So because of that, this group, they saw themselves as Anglo-Saxons. So white, and then also Anglo-Saxon, English stock, and Protestant, because ever since, America has pretty much always been majority Protestant since colonial times. It was founded by Protestants, and it's been majority Protestant pretty much that whole time. So it makes sense that they would call themselves this. But anyway, America had a lot of Protestants, and there weren't many Catholics, and there certainly weren't many Orthodox people or Jewish people or any other groups. But anyway, all of that aside, I do want to make a final point, and then I want to wrap this video up. I do want to differentiate, because I've talked about immigration, I've talked about old stock American, and there is something I do want to differentiate, because there is a notion that America was like founded by immigrants, as a nation of immigrants. And this notion is not incredibly justified. I do not think it's really true. And a lot of people would agree with me on this. that it's just not true that America is like a nation of immigrants, because it's a nation of settlers. It was created by settlers. That is a very different thing, because an immigrant is someone who is leaving one nation for another nation. Now, you did see this to an extent in the colonial period, but not very much. What you saw is settlers. People from Britain, whether they were English or Scottish or Welsh or Irish or Scotch-Irish, coming to another part of Britain, which was this new Britain, this Britain in a different continent, the Americas, to create a new life and to create a new civilization. That is very different from what immigration is. Immigration is coming from one civilization to a totally different one. So a better example of what that would look like is someone from Germany coming to the colonies. That would be immigration, because they're coming from Germany to an area that's already starting to be settled. But anyway, so all that to say, America was created by settlers, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't immigration. Considering there were French and Germans and Danes and the Dutch, of course. The Dutch are a bad example because they were already here, but because there were French and Germans, and the Danes, it is fair to say that America has always had immigrants since its founding. But I do want to make that differentiation, because it's kind of inappropriate to say that someone who's an old stock American is also descended from immigrants. But anyway, that's all I wanted to say. So, thank you for watching this video, and goodbye.